I'll welcome Mr. Jeff Kennett.
Thank you, David, very much for the invitation today, and to all of you for coming along and both listening to the performance and I guess listening to the message. To your president, Michael Venus, who rang me up and begged me to appear here today. Thank you, Michael, wherever you are. It's always a pleasure to attend and accept a personal invitation, and the person who invites you is off on holidays. David, can I just say to you, I didn't find being Premier stressful at all, nor did I find being President of the Hawthorn Football Club stressful. That's not to say that many who worked with me did not feel stressed by either my leadership or the task ahead, but I do think in life it is terribly important to know yourself well and to try and maintain a balance in your life, whatever you do, because while often we have to get professional support, we have to, as best we can, accept responsibility for the amount of time we put into a particular job, the hours we put in, and unless you get a balance, then you leave yourselves wide open to more stress, more anxiety, and that can, if not treated, can lead to clinical depression and or worse. Secondly, can I congratulate the Press Club, it's not something I do publicly, often or normally, on sponsoring the MTC with this production. I think it's very, very encouraging from 2 points of view. I think this particular play is terribly important, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But more importantly, I think for the Press Club to educate yourself about theatre and the arts more fully than perhaps you would normally do as individuals, I think it's a step in the right direction. And I'd like to think that the Press Club might not form an ongoing relationship with the MTC rather than one particular production. Because it's always been my view that if we're going to get the best out of life, and I think we do here in Melbourne, you've got to live in a city that has a cultural heart. And if you don't have a cultural heart, then you're not exposing yourself to the thoughts, the views, the plays, the music of others. You're not experiencing the emotions that go and are associated through the performances or the statues or the sculptures, the fine arts that are produced by artists. And I think ever since Sir Redmond Barry in the 1860s came along and committed this community to a university much bigger than the population of the time demanded, or he opened up the museum and the library, that was the seed for a cultural heart that has blossomed in this state for very many years. So I think the partnership is excellent, and I would like to think that it would continue. May I first of all just own up and say I haven't seen Next to Normal yet. I was meant to be there on the opening night but was overseas, but we're scheduled to go there next Thursday night, Felicity and I. And the MTC, of which we are subscribers, I think it's true to say over the last few years has gone from strength to strength. They put on a number of productions in any one year. Some of them I come away from feeling isn't that fantastic, and some of them I miss the first half and wake up to see it concluded. But I think that's what art is all about. Not every piece is always going to satisfy you, but it exposes you to something different. And that is the fundamental basis of this particular play, Next to Normal, which even the name is intriguing. What's normal? Who is normal? There isn't a norm that we can easily measure our own performance by, let alone a collection of us or a community. And if we were able to do that, then quite obviously we live in a very boring place. It's our own personalities, it's our differences, it's our different shapes and sizes, language, that makes it such an exciting place to live. But in this case, Next to Normal is the extraordinary experience of telling through a musical the story of a family, among thousands, any one of thousands of families in Australia that actually live the subject of this play on a normal basis and a daily basis. And so many of those families do not have access to good care, in some cases by their own volition. They're not comfortable to seek help. In so many cases, not only with mental illness, but with disabilities, it leads to a breakdown within the family. And I'm sad to say it's more often than not the male who leaves, who can't handle the continual requirement to make special provision for those who are suffering. And this play, therefore, exposes the audience to emotions which are not in themselves unusual, but to have them in front of you is very, very confronting. And it's why, as Matt said, after a production, and Kate reinforced, that so many people there either know of someone who's been ill, have been in the same position themselves, and relate so well to what is occurring on stage. And I can understand why those who form part of the cast at the end of every performance are so drawn. I just said to Kate a moment ago, I have no doubt that this play, and I'm sure it will apply to Matt as well, will affect their lives for the rest of time. Even though they have had experiences themselves and friends and family with this sort of illness, the reality is they're doing this night after night. They're actually telling a story in real time and real emotion. And in order to get the response from the community that the community or the audience expects, it's got to be a sublime performance. Now, I think this is important. I just said to Anne, I will go back after this. I've got about 60 people working for me at Beyond Blue, and I'll give them the opportunity at our expense with their partners to all attend the show one night when we might go as a group, to give them another insight to the work that they do. I think it's important. I'd love to think that somehow the Press Club could make contact with every journalist here in Melbourne, and they go and see the show, not to boost the attendances, but to watch and to listen, to be moved. Because over the last 11 years that Beyond Blue has been in existence, as we try and keep educating the public, reducing the stigma, we've had many sessions with journalists, and I've got to say in the main, most journalists today are a lot more educated about depressive illnesses and mental illnesses and treat stories differently through that education. But you can't become complacent. You can't believe that what we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago is any longer sufficient to keep people's mind focused. And the sad thing about mental illness, it can happen. It can come upon you or a family member or a workplace colleague at any time without any notice. So people often assume that you, Jeff Kennett, have taken on the work of Chairman of Beyond Blue because at some stage I suffered depression. And I think it was after the 99 election. Well, I try and correct them. I don't know whether they believe me or not. But I have never had clinical depression. But when people ask me about it, I respond along the line, I haven't had clinical depression, but I don't assume that I never will avoid it. I could wake up one morning in a fetal position, as could any of you, with bipolar, a serious mental illness, young males, adolescents, maybe having a most wonderful life and sporting career and wake up one morning with schizophrenia. So we can never assume that we are not going to be hit by this particular illness at one level or another. Over 1 million suffer it every year. For every person who suffers, there's probably 2 carers, so that's 3 million people who now are intimately affected by depression and mental illness. And that doesn't take into account the workforce. I remember when a young journalist, or not so young journalist, a couple of years ago, died at the age, took his own life. And the editor was on the phone to me immediately, as was the person who sat in the desk next to him. And he was, as you would understand, absolutely distraught. He saw no signs that this individual was depressed. And yet he went out and took his life. We have no real knowledge of both the social impact of depression in the workplace, although we have an economic understanding of the cost. Economic is important, but it's not nearly as important as the social cost and addressing the issue. So this play gives us another method through which we can try and educate the public, try and have them understand the extraordinary pressures that are applied to families when one of their number is suffering and suffering seriously. With bipolar, which is the illness of this play, if diagnosed young enough, correctly, at any stage of life, but preferably young, and if the response to the diagnosis proves to be effective with the individual, you can manage your life and live a very, very full life. There are many people in our society today who suffer a serious mental illness, who will never be cured of it, but can manage their illness and live either as sportsmen and women or as senior politicians or as senior corporate people, a major mental illness. But just as I am not a mechanic, and if my car breaks down I've got to ring up the RACV or go and visit someone, so too if my health breaks down. The moment you admit that you have an issue which you cannot yourself understand or explain, you should go and seek help. And that, in one sense, is the greatest message we from Beyond Blue try and impart to our community. You'll have seen with the budget the other night, federal budget, that the federal government has put a lot more money into mental health over the next 5 years. That's excellent, wonderful. A lot of it is going to preventative, that is early treatment, young people, get them early. A lot of it is going to develop a system using IT of taking access to the best brains out into isolated areas. Country, rural, isolated areas of Australia through the computer. Very, very important work. Been tried many times, hasn't been successful. I'm sure one day we'll get it right. But importantly, the policy announced the other day indicates that mental health will, the government will set up a mental health commission which will be answerable to the Prime Minister and to the Parliament. Now that means that mental health, which has been the ugly duckling of the health portfolio for 200 years, is now back there at least, if not better, than being an equal partner. We can't make up for 200 years of lost time. We can't expect the governments to spend as much money as is necessary right now because, to be quite honest, if they threw money at us, we couldn't spend it. It's going to take time to build up the workforce. It's going to take time to build up the facilities. But again, politicians of all sides of the Parliament understand the importance of mental health. First time it's ever happened, this education over the last 10 years. So we are in a much better place than we are today. I was just saying to Kate, when I was in politics, which is now well over a decade ago, long time, there was a member on the other side of the House called Neil Cole, who probably 15 years ago started to have difficulties with a mental illness. And I remember Neil saying to me, and he's said many times since, how appallingly his own side of politics treated him because no one understood the issue. He left Parliament, he's now gone on and written many plays about mental illness, depression, etc. And again, his work is spreading the word from the point of view of someone who has suffered. So we've got to look always for new forms of communication. When we set up Beyond Blue and we established the board, I invited Gary McDonald to come on board because Gary suffered anxiety. And anxiety is widely spread. In fact, you'll see us continuing our work on depression at Beyond Blue, but putting a lot of emphasis on anxiety as well. Again, if you can deal with it, if you can manage it, if you can cure it, it will stop it continuing or perhaps becoming a full-blown clinical depressive illness. Gary, being part of our board, and he's just resigned unfortunately, but 10 years, quite understandable, has been invaluable because he has given freely, he's gone out and spoken publicly, he's well known, so when he gets up to speak, people listen to him. Mother and Son, the show that he was in, which was such a wonderful production, again talked about dementia and helped people come to understand it a little better while having a good laugh, and that's absolutely acceptable. So the arts are important. It's probably true to say there is no more incidence of depressive illness and mental illness in the arts than there is in sport or any other profession. But so many artists, particularly in the early part of their career, I always equate them with being an orchid. They're put in a tight-fitting little container. They've got to fight for survival, and every now and then a shoot comes up, a beautiful shoot. which flowers into the most glorious flower through a piece of visual art or a dance or a piece of music. There are many in the arts profession who suffer from a mental illness. I've been a supporter of one particular artist for a number of years, and she's probably not yet 40. And on several occasions we've almost lost her when it all got too much. But she's just one of many. And so I really do welcome this production. I welcome the tie-up, the connect between the Press Club and the MTC on this particular production. As I said, it would be nice to think that all journalists of every shape, colour and size saw it, because it would help you in terms of retelling stories in the future, giving you a better understanding, if you don't have much of an understanding now, of just how these illnesses not only affect the person that's ill, but can shatter families and test families in many cases to the breaking point.